All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Books and Books in Coral Gables. Thank you all for coming down tonight. As you can see from these lights and these cameras, we are live streaming this event on the internet this evening. A couple notes for our internet audience at home. If at any time during the presentation you would like to purchase a copy of A Wicked War, just call the number on your screen. We will take care of that for you. We will have Professor Greenberg sign it, and we will ship it to you wherever you are in the United States for free. For those of you watching from overseas, the shipping might cost just a little bit more. This evening, Books and Books is very happy to present Professor Amy S. Greenberg and her new book, A Wicked War, Polk, Clay, Lincoln, and the 1846 U.S. Invasion of Mexico. Professor Greenberg is Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of History and Women's Studies at Penn State University. She is a leading scholar of Manifest Destiny, and her previous books include Manifest Manhood and the Antebellum American Empire and Cause for Alarm, the Volunteer Fire Department in the 19th Century. In this book, her skilled storytelling and rigorous scholarship bring this often forgotten and overlooked American war for empire to life with memorable characters, plot lines, and legacies. This is the definitive history of the 1846 conflict, painting an intimate portrait of the major players and their world. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Professor Amy S. Greenberg.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming. I'm here to talk to you about this book, A Wicked War. I'll tell you about this book. I am a professor of antebellum American history, which means I teach a lot of times the early American Republic from 1780 to 1860. One of the major things that happens in that time period is the war between the U.S. and Mexico, which took place in 1846, which brought California, New Mexico, part of Texas, into the United States. And as a teacher, I was unable to find any book about this war that struck me as worth teaching. There are several books about the war which are good if you like military history. One of them is John D. Eisenhower's So Far From God. Very, very good look at the battles of the war. Many of the battles were very interesting. But personally, I found books like that really boring. And it may be just that I'm not interested in military history personally. The U.S.-Mexico War, it struck me, was something that my students needed to learn about. So every year I would give them a different book about the U.S.-Mexico War, and they didn't like any of them. And I realized that the problem was that people, including students, are interested in people. They're interested in characters and what happens to individuals in their lives. And this is one of the reasons that we read history, I think, is to see how people in the past coped with adversity, dealt with horrible things and exciting things that happened to them, and in order to kind of learn from their experiences, to see what they did so that maybe we don't make the same mistakes they did. The problem is that most Americans don't know anything about the U.S.-Mexico War. We know about wars that we like. We know about the Revolution. We know about the Civil War. We know about World War II. These were wars that Americans in general are proud of. And there's obvious reasons why we're proud of these wars. They're wars that are about principle, that demonstrate what the American character is made of, that prove that we are willing to go to war in order to achieve grand objectives, which are not just of interest to us, but of worldwide significance. The Revolution introduced the idea that a republic could be born and sustain itself and grow and prosper without becoming an empire. The Civil War, of course, was this incredibly devastating war that led to the loss of either 660,000 lives or, as historians have recently re-estimated, 850,000 lives, but out of which a unified nation was born without slavery. And World War II, of course, I don't need to tell you about. This is the war that we go to protect freedom in Europe and freedom in Asia. And we volunteered to fight in that war, even though it wasn't necessarily so much about us. But then there's other wars that we don't know so much about. And these are wars that don't really speak to things that Americans think are important. And I'd put in that list Vietnam, the War of 1812, Korea, and certainly the U.S.-Mexico War. When you compare the number of books that have been written about the Civil War versus the U.S.-Mexico War, it's unbelievable how few have been written about the U.S.-Mexico War. But if it were not for the U.S.-Mexico War, California would not be part of the United States. New Mexico would not be part of the United States. The southern portion of Texas wouldn't be part of the United States. The U.S.-Mexico War is the war that made the United States what it is today. I'm trying to get this to move. It's not working. Let's see. There we go. I took the title from my book, from a quote from Ulysses S. Grant, who all of you know. He was a young lieutenant in the U.S.-Mexico War. This was his first major conflict. He's straight out of West Point. And he was part of an army of 4,000 sent by President Polk from Louisiana to march down into an occupied portion of Mexico claimed by Texas. And looking back, this is at the end of his life, here's what he had to say about the Mexican War, that there was never a more wicked war fought by one nation against another. And he knew at the time, when he was a youngster, that it was an unjust and immoral war, but he didn't have the moral courage to resign. And I was so struck by this quote for a number of reasons. First of all, that Grant, who of course survived the Civil War, that this was the war that he thought was the bad war. This was the war that he looked back on and he had misgivings about. I liked the idea that he was willing to admit that had he had more courage, he would have stood up against the war, because what I found in this book and what I write about is that there were actually a lot of Americans who found the U.S.-Mexico War deplorable for a number of reasons, and got together and formed what I call the first anti-war movement in American history, which is to say that a war that started out extremely popular ends up becoming extremely divisive, and that people from across the country, ordinary people, politicians, they decide that the war needs to be stopped. So that's part of the story that I'm telling here. And I'm still trying to get this clicker to work. Can you help me with it? Okay, good, thank you. Here's a map of the United States and Mexico at the start of the war, so you can see how big Mexico was before the U.S.-Mexico War. So when I set out to write a book about the U.S.-Mexico War that my students would want to read, to be honest, I was really thinking about a book about the U.S.-Mexico War that I wanted to read. The books that were out there I found unsatisfying for one reason or another, but I think the main reason that I found all of the books on the U.S.-Mexico War that were out there unsatisfying was because they weren't really about people. They were about battles. And I wanted to write a book that was about the human experience of the U.S.-Mexico War, what the war meant to soldiers who went and fought in it, to the families of soldiers who were killed in the war, because this war had a horrible fatality rate. It had the highest fatality rate of any war except the Civil War in American history. Most of the soldiers who died in the war died of disease rather than battlefield wounds, but horrible. It also had the highest desertion rate of any American war. And I wanted to write about that experience for Americans, what it meant to have a loved one go fight in Mexico and not come home. And you'll find a lot of stories about that in here. And you'll also find a lot of stories about the experience of common soldiers who were overwhelmingly enthusiastic about the start of the war. The war, for those of you who don't know, began in 1846 when President James K. Polk told the American people that American blood had been shed on American soil and that we were forced into a war that we didn't want to be involved in. And this was not at all true. He had sent the army, including Grant, into a contested area which had never been part of the state of Texas, which was now, of course, at this point, a recently annexed state, had previously been a republic. He sent the army down there deliberately to provoke a battle which ended up happening. Everybody in Congress, when asked to vote in support of the war, this was also the first war where Congress was not asked to declare war, but basically to just agree to a war that was already happening. People in Congress understood that what Polk said was a lie, but they voted in favor of the war anyways. And many thousands more men volunteered to fight in Mexico than there was room to take. Throughout the South and the Midwest, basically everywhere except New England, men were turned away who volunteered to fight for this war. And that, in part, is because the Texas Revolution had taken place 8 years earlier. And in the Texas Revolution, Mexicans committed atrocities against Texians, as they were known then, particularly at the Alamo and at Goliad. And a lot of the young men in America were raised on stories of how treacherous Mexicans were, and that Mexicans loved to kill Texians who were Americans. And so the overwhelming cry throughout America when Polk went to the country and said, we've been forced into this war, was, yes, we want to go down to Mexico and we want to kill Mexicans. And common soldiers write about this in their diaries. They also hope to find excitement and adventure in Mexico, to meet beautiful women, to prove their bravery in hand-to-hand combat. They had a lot of things they were hoping for. A lot of them thought we could take Mexican land. This was the period of manifest destiny and the ideology that America would continue to grow and get bigger, perhaps indefinitely. People talked about the United States expanding not just across North America, but into South America as well. We think this is hilarious now because we think of the continental boundaries of the United States as fixed, but at that time, people didn't think that way. They thought, who knew how big Mexico would, the United States would become? And so all of these men, they go down into Mexico, hoping to fight, and James K. Polk supports them. He sets up regiments of volunteers. Some men are turned away, and the volunteers march down into Mexico. Now, ever since 1988, when James McPherson published A Battle Cry of Freedom, which is the magisterial book that won the Pulitzer Prize about the Civil War, most people have thought about the Mexican War in terms of the Civil War. And what I mean by that is that if they think about the Mexican War at all, they think of it as like the bad little war that forced the United States into the big, terrible war. And the reason that it led to the big, terrible war is that the annexation of so much land from Mexico made it impossible for the South and North to continue half slave and half free, because the South wanted that land to have slavery, the North didn't. And James K. Polk is clearly part of the story. He's a slaveholder, but above all else, what he cares about is not the extension of slavery. He cares about making the United States bigger. So he provokes this war against Mexico. It's the first war that started with a lie by a president, certainly not the last, but the wars basically started with a lie. The American people, some of them buy it, a lot of them don't. Members of Congress, almost nobody buys it, but they line up and they vote in favor of the war anyways because they don't want to look unpatriotic. And frankly, we have an American army that's in harm's way in Mexican territory and they need to be supported. And then American soldiers march off to battle. And this U.S.-Mexico War, one reason why military historians have loved talking about it is that the United States won every single battle it was involved in, except for the Battle of San Pasqual in California, which most military historians call a skirmish rather than a battle, so we can continue to say that we won every battle. The Battle of Buena Vista, which you see here, was the most famous battle of the U.S.-Mexico War. In this battle, 5,000 Americans defeated an army of 20,000 Mexicans in hand-to-hand combat, and it was exactly the kind of battle that volunteers were hoping for, and very few volunteers actually got to take part in. At the time that the Battle of Buena Vista took place, Americans proclaimed that it would live on forever in the memory of the United States, up there with Lexington and Concord, which of course did not happen at all. Nobody remembers the Battle of Buena Vista whatsoever. And I have to say on this point, actually, that growing up in Southern California, I never learned about the U.S.-Mexico War. We skipped straight from the missions to the Bear Flag Revolt without any explanation of how the land changed hands whatsoever. So this is definitely a forgotten war in American history. So that was one battle that volunteers in the United States liked. This is a Mexican print of the one of the early battles of the war. There are very few Mexican images of the battles that took place in this war. The United States produced tons of prints, but Mexico very few. Another example of hand-to-hand combat. The reason that the United States won every battle that it was involved in, except for San Pascal, is basically because we had just much better weaponry than Mexico did. And Mexicans had very, very old and poor guns. In some battles, there weren't enough bullets for the guns. We had small cannons that were fantastic. The Mexicans didn't. The most effective Mexican fighting force was actually a battalion of American deserters called the San Patricios, who were Catholics. The idea of them, or the reputation of them, is that they were all Irish, but they weren't. A lot of them were German, but all of them were Catholic, and they were all deserters from the U.S. Army who decided that they would rather not fight other Catholics in a time period when the United States was very, very anti-Catholic. It was a Protestant nation, and Catholics were discriminated against. So they went and they fought for Mexico, and they used American armaments against the American Army quite effectively. Oops. Here is a poster from 1844, which is not in the book, but I think is really lovely. And what this poster kind of shows you is that even before the election of 1844, which was when Polk was elected, Americans knew that electing James K. Polk would lead to war with Mexico. And the reason that they knew that is that in the election of 1844, which is one of the early chapters of the book, I start with the Texas Revolution, move through the election of 1844, and then into the war itself. In the election of 1844, both of the frontrunners, Henry Clay and Martin Van Buren, rejected the annexation of Texas because they said it would lead to war with Mexico, and people understood this. And the list of reasons why you should vote for Henry Clay instead of James K. Polk, who was the first dark horse candidate in American history, who became the Democratic candidate because he was in favor of annexing Texas and he was in favor of annexing California. People said, well, look, if you vote for Polk, you're going to end up with a war with Mexico. And here we have a print of the bombing of Veracruz. So just quickly, I'll tell you a little bit about the war. Polk declares war in May of 1846, and the initial battles of the war are all successfully won in northern Mexico to secure the lowest portion of Texas. And Zachary Taylor is the general. He takes the fight into northern Mexico and successfully captures Mexico. At the same time, General Stephen Kearny marches with an army from Fort Leavenworth directly west. He secures Santa Fe without any bloodshed at all, and then marches all the way to California, securing California and New Mexico. So really by the summer of 1847, really the summer of 1846, the first few months of the war, pretty much every objective that the president wanted had been accomplished. California had been secured, New Mexico was secured, Texas was secured, and the war should have been over, but Mexico remarkably refused to come to terms, peace terms. So it turned out that the Mexicans were not necessarily happy about an American army invading them. They refused to sign any peace treaty, and it was at that point that Polk decided the only way to get Mexico to settle with the United States, to sign over California, to sign over New Mexico, was to invade the heart of Mexico itself. So he sent General Winfield Scott and most of the U.S. Army in Mexico down to the port of Veracruz, which is a walled, fortified city in the southern portion of Mexico, and ordered him to bombard Veracruz and then march up to Mexico City, following the same route that Hernan Cortez had taken and captured Mexico initially against Montezuma. And remarkably, Zachary Taylor was able to do this. He was able to take an American army and march through central Mexico, through the most densely populated portion of Mexico, and capture the capital of a neighboring republic, but at an incredible cost. The bombing of Veracruz, the way that Scott captured Veracruz was by just bombarding it for 36 hours with cannon fire. Unfortunately, all of the population of Veracruz was actually in the city when this happened, so it led to enormous loss of life and very bad publicity about the war back home in America, because this is the first American war that has embedded journalists traveling with the Army. Nowadays, an embedded journalist would have his or her dispatches probably edited and censored by a central government. In the United States in the 1840s, the central government really doesn't have the reach that it has now. So people were able to write anything that they wanted and send it back home to newspapers and have it published. And as a result, people in the United States learned about the bombing of Veracruz, and there was a huge outcry against this because the United States was not supposed to be a country where soldiers stayed on a boat and bombarded a city until an enormous number of people were killed and then called that a battle. It was an extremely effective tactic, and Winfield Scott, to the end of his life, always upheld his decision to do this. He said there was no other way to take this fortified city than through the bombardment, but people in the United States weren't really so sure. And I love this print because I wonder when I look at it who this print was intended for. What we have here is an image of women and children being killed in a city by Americans. This is an American print. So I'm just wondering who would want to buy this print. Like, why is this a print you would want to buy? This is another reason why we don't think about or write about the war, is because the U.S.-Mexico War, unlike, say, the Revolution or the Civil War, was not a war fought about principle. When we think about the Civil War, we think about it as a war that was fought to end slavery. Now, you could argue, actually, it was a war fought to save the Union. That was what most soldiers going into it thought. But still, that's a principle, right? The U.S.-Mexico War is not a war fought for any principle. Not even James K. Polk, the president and mastermind of the war, could claim that there was a principle behind it. So this is one reason why we don't remember it, and why also I think it needs to be remembered. So some of you have probably seen this image. It's War News from Mexico by Richard Catton Woodville. And it's a fantastic image of the power of newspapers in antebellum America. In fact, the image here is really not that unrealistic. Newspapers were read by groups of people. Oftentimes, a single person would read an article out loud to a group of people gathered together in public settings. And here, this image, when you first look at it, makes you think, well, actually, people are really excited about the War News from Mexico, and we can think about them getting news about a great victory like the Battle of Buena Vista. But in fact, this is really a very ambivalent image. Woodville was from Baltimore, so he was from a slave state. And he makes clear in this image, I think, when you look at it closely, that Mexico is going to be a problem. And I think you can see that when you see that there are slaves sitting on the front step, listening closely to see what's going to happen. I don't know if you can see the guy who is tossing a match into a barrel. So at first, everybody reads this image and they say, War News from Mexico. People are so excited to learn the news from Mexico. And it's true, but on the other hand, what exactly is the war going to lead to? This is part of the story that I tell in the book. So I told you guys one of the things that this book does is it charts the impact of the war on individuals. And I have several families that I chart through the course of the book, and you'll learn about characters like John Hardin, who was a congressman from Illinois and Abraham Lincoln's chief rival in the political party that they belonged in. He was killed at the Battle of Buena Vista, and you'll learn about his daughter, who ends up founding the Daughters of the American Revolution. You'll learn about James K. Polk, but you'll also learn about his wife, who played a really important political role. And you'll learn about a lot of other people who were affected by the war in a really profound way. One of them is Henry Clay, who was that candidate in 1844. Henry Clay's favorite son, Henry Clay Jr., was also killed at the Battle of Buena Vista, along with John Hardin. Henry Clay, of course, was totally opposed to the war. His stance against the war probably cost him the election in 1844. His son also was opposed to the war, but interestingly, in 1846, a number of people in the opposition party, was the Whig Party, people that were totally opposed to James K. Polk, thought Polk was lying, and weren't even in support of the war. Prominent, wealthy people, they volunteered to go fight in the war. This would not happen today, right? People went and fought. Their sons went and fought. They were all opposed to the war. They thought this was the American thing to do, and a lot of them died. And when Henry Clay's favorite son died, he took a very costly stance against the war, and this is one of the things that I write about. But another thing that I write about is Americans turning against a war where they learn that Americans are committing atrocities. And again, this is one of the functions of the embedded journalists. At first, embedded journalists are very supportive of the American effort, but as time goes on, American soldiers, particularly volunteers, behave pretty badly in Mexico and commit a number of atrocities against civilians, the most famous of which is this murder, basically cold-blooded murder of 24 or 25 Mexican men, women, and children in a cave in central Mexico after Mexican partisans had killed an Arkansas volunteer. So the Arkansas volunteers, who were called the Rackensackers, they basically just rounded up a bunch of people because they couldn't figure out who actually killed their comrade, and they took him to a cave and they killed them. And this was reported in the United States. And as far as I can tell, this is the first American war where atrocities are reported in the newspapers. And it goes a long way towards making Americans think that we ought to get out of Mexico and ought to get out of it soon. So these are some of the stories that I tell in the book. For the most part, I would say the book attempts to make sense of a war that we don't want to think about by looking at the individual experience, the experience of soldiers and the experience of families, and relating that to things that are going on in the time period. Things like slavery, things like changing roles for women in the family, a whole host of social issues that happen. So when I began, I talked about not being able to find a book about the Mexico War that I enjoyed or I wanted to read. So basically what I did here is I tried to write a book that I wanted to read. So I hope it's a book that you like to read too, and I'll be happy to take your questions. Yeah?
Question. I've always known the war to be known as the Mexican-American War, but I hear you call it the U.S.-Mexico War. Tell me.
Okay, so you know, names are always tricky things. And people stopped calling it the Mexican-American War because it made it sound like it's about Mexican-Americans. It's not a terrible name, but we have people we call Mexican-Americans, so it was sort of confusing. So the U.S.-Mexico War, U.S.-Mexican War, it gives equal side to both sides. Another thing it's often known as just the Mexican War, right? So you still see Mexican-American War? Yeah.
What do they call it in Mexico?
The War of Northern Aggression. The War of Northern Aggression, right. Yeah, absolutely. That one was easy, right? It's an easy one for them. Yeah.
I grew up in Mexico. They also call it the invasion.
Yeah, right.
And
Invasion.
as I was growing up in Mexico, we haven't forgotten the war.
No.
It's taught since almost fourth grade. You learn about it. And there's jokes about reclaiming back the territory in a Pacific way.
Yeah.
With all the immigration
Yeah.
issues we have in the different states in the southern part of the United States. But we learn also about the turmoil that was going on in Mexico. And I don't know, I haven't read your book yet, but I look forward to it. I don't know how much your book covers the political turmoil.
You can't understand the war unless you understand what's going on in Mexico. Like, for instance, in the Battle of Veracruz, the Mexican commander was waiting for reinforcements to show up from Mexico City, but because of the Pocos revolt, there was nobody in charge in Mexico City. So this guy's pleas for munitions and more soldiers just go completely unheard. I mean, it's a ridiculous story. Really, when you think about it, at the time of the Mexican independence from Spain, Mexico and the United States have almost equal populations and almost equal wealth. And the United States skyrockets in both, and Mexico stagnates. So I don't talk about Mexico as much as I could, but I don't think you can understand the war unless you understand that. And I'm so pleased to talk to somebody who actually learned about this growing up because, yeah, it's really understood in Mexico, but not in the United States.
And it was just one more comment. I was in New Mexico, and we went in a tour, and they mentioned the history of the state. They never spoke about the war.
That's exactly right. That's right. I have a brother who teaches elementary school in a largely Hispanic school, and he said that most of the kids that he teaches who are first-generation Mexican Americans, that they don't know that the land where they are, which is Santa Barbara, California, used to be part of Mexico. Like, they don't know. And the textbooks still are they don't talk about it a lot. Why would we talk about this war?
Well, there's a lot of points in the American history that are not taught in these schools, but do you concentrate, do you pay any attention or any focus on the Texas Revolution? Kind of preceded the war?
It's very funny that you asked that. When I first started writing this war, I did not want to talk about the Texas Revolution. Didn't want to do it. If I knew anything, I didn't want to do it. And ultimately, I had to start with the Texas Revolution because that's where the whole thing starts, right? That's where it starts. So I don't think the first chapter of the book is the strongest chapter because it's about Texas. And the Texas thing is so confusing. It's such a mess. But yeah, you have to start with Texas.
Because, I went to college in Texas, and to graduate from a state college in Texas, you need 12 credits in history, 6 in U.S. history, and 6 in Texas history. And the Texas Revolution, the way it's taught in Texas, public education system, is completely different than. I mean, it's a very heroic war. The discussion of containing slavery or saving slavery is not even discussed, which was really the main focus of the war. So I'm just interested to see how you kind of address the Texas Revolution.
Austin, the state capital, in the last, I'd say, 10 years, they built the most amazing and beautiful Texas History Museum. And the narrative of the Texas Revolution is one where the Tejanos are all in support of Texas independence, and the slaves are supporters of Texas independence too. And it's just mind-blowing. And it's such a beautiful museum. It has these very interactive, it's a very youth-oriented, super interactive museum. I talk a lot in Texas, and every time I go down there, I get asked the question, but don't you think Texas annexation was a good idea? People always ask me that. So.
You used the words earlier that it's not an empire. One of the fundamental, I think the United States of America is an empire. And you go back, Louisiana Purchase, more than doubled the size of the United States.
It did.
It had nothing to do with any principles or anything other than Napoleon needed some money to fight the Brits, and he sold the Louisiana Purchase. Right. Mexico was the same. Maybe you can confirm, but my reading, the little reading I've done about Polk, is that he wanted to go for Canada as well, but realized he couldn't do Canada and Mexico at the same time. Then you get a few years later buying Alaska off Russia, and we'll forget Hawaii and Puerto Rico. It's an empire. It happened to be contiguous, or virtually contiguous.
I wrote a book about this. Actually, I've written 2 books that are about this idea. I think about it all the time. And, the thing to know about Polk is that he did not fight Britain for the Oregon Territory. The Oregon Territory was twice as big as the amount that we eventually got. The Oregon Territory initially included all of British Columbia. And Polk did not fight for that. We certainly had more of a claim to British Columbia than we had to Texas. And everybody at the time, all of those Democrats in the North who voted for Polk, they voted for him because they believed that he was going to take the Oregon Territory, which belonged to the United States in their opinion, from Britain. And he settled. He just split it in half because he knew he couldn't fight 2 wars at once, didn't want to fight Britain, and was happy to fight Mexico. Now, a lot of people at the time, I don't know if this is fair or not, they concluded from this that Polk, being a slave owner, was only interested in taking land where there was slavery, or there could be slavery. Texas most certainly had slavery, regardless of what the Texas History Museum says. I did some research in London actually on this issue, and it seems pretty clear the British would have given up all of the Oregon Territory. They wouldn't have gone to war to keep British Columbia from the United States. But whether the United States has always been an empire, I certainly would argue that this is the first imperial war. Scholars who look at all of the Indian wars, they say, no, all the Indian wars were imperial wars. Because remember, the United States is constantly fighting wars to take land from Indians. These don't make it into the narrative as wars because they're not fought against other republics or other nations. They're fought against the Black Hawk Indians, they're fought against the Cherokee, they're fought against the Seminole, they're fought against countless tribes over and over and over again, all about becoming an imperial power. But I see the U.S.-Mexico War as the real imperial war. But you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Two more questions. You didn't mention Arizona. Was it part of the New Mexico territory? Is that why?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So Arizona is part of that.
And though you mentioned Polk, Clay, and Lincoln, you haven't talked about Lincoln tonight.
Absolutely. So the book is really about 5 characters: Polk, Clay, Abraham Lincoln, a guy named Nicholas Trist, who's the real hero of the war, who negotiates a treaty to end the war even though he's been recalled by James K. Polk, and a guy named John Hardin, who I mentioned, who was the primary rival to Abraham Lincoln in Illinois and was killed at the Battle of Buena Vista, and that's why we don't know who he is. Abraham Lincoln is really, really interesting in the context of this book. All of these characters have strange, interacting, overlapping histories. And Abraham Lincoln, who desperately wants to go to Congress, he's a state senator in Illinois. When he gets elected to Congress, he wants to talk about economic issues because that's what he cares about. He cares about establishing a central banking system in the United States. He cares about young men like himself who start out poor being able to get loans so that they can make something of themselves. He cares about tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods so that we can get some American manufacturing going. He really cares about economics. He doesn't care about the U.S.-Mexico War. But on his route to Washington, D.C. from Illinois, he travels through Lexington, Kentucky, and he hears Henry Clay, whose son has just died in the Battle of Buena Vista. He hears Henry Clay give a speech about how terrible the Mexican War is, and he goes to Washington, and what does he talk about? He doesn't talk about economic issues. His first national speeches are about why the U.S.-Mexico War is bad. Now, Lincoln is not reelected to Congress, and at the time, a lot of people said it's because he opposed the U.S.-Mexico War. Illinois was very, very supportive of the war, and Lincoln said some pretty damning things about the war that led to him being called, among Democrats in Illinois, Spotty Lincoln, because his first speech in Congress was about the exact spot where American blood, according to Polk, was shed on American soil. And Lincoln, being the lawyer that he is, he gives this series of points in his first congressional speech where he says, well, let's see, how exactly is this American soil? And so let's look at the spot where the blood was shed, and he shows that basically American blood was shed on Mexican soil, that we had actually invaded Mexico, which was true. And then he goes on and gives another inflammatory speech. So Lincoln's single term in Congress, the only national position that he has before he runs for president and wins, is this congressional term where he talks about the U.S.-Mexico War. So that's kind of the story of Lincoln. There's a lot more in here about Lincoln, though, particularly his relationship with John Hardin and how he comes to power after Hardin's killed. Yeah.
What was the Gadsden Purchase?
Yeah, the Gadsden Purchase. So at the end of the U.S.-Mexico War, the U.S. signed a treaty called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that specified a boundary between the U.S. and Mexico, which was based on a faulty map. So when commissioners from both Mexico and the United States went and tried to chart a line of the new boundary between the U.S. and Mexico, they completely failed because the map that the treaty was based on was just faulty. It didn't actually line up with what was on the ground. So at the end of this attempt by the commissioners to chart a treaty, a lot of people in the United States said, no, we actually deserve and we need more land than this. So in 1853, 1854, the United States sends a commissioner down to Mexico and says, look, we need to actually buy some more land from you. And it's General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is in power again. He's the major general and president during the U.S.-Mexico War, and also, amazingly, during the Texas Revolution. The guy just keeps coming back over and over again. And Santa Anna agrees to sell a small portion of what's now Arizona to the United States. That's the Gadsden Purchase. The main purpose of the Gadsden Purchase was to provide a workable railroad route for a southern transcontinental railroad, but it ends up not being good enough for a railroad anyway. So in other words, the whole purpose of the treaty was kind of pointless. Yeah.
I noticed in your massacre picture up there on the left side, there's the Jesus Christ figure, the cross and everything.
Yeah.
Do you know how exactly does that fit in with this story?
Okay, so this image that you're looking at here was drawn by a volunteer, an Illinois volunteer in the war, named Sam Chamberlain, who claimed that he actually witnessed this happening. We don't actually know if that's true or not. But what Sam Chamberlain did is he was a remarkable artist. So he left all of these visual representations of things that happened in the war. And he thought that this was terrible, this slaughter in the caves. So I think he's trying to represent Mexicans crying out for mercy and not coming. But his images are all really remarkable. Yeah?
Why do you think they stopped the limits they stopped and they didn't go forward? They already had the capital of the country.
Yeah, so this is a great question. So starting in September of 1847, the U.S. had captured Mexico City and was occupying Mexico City, which always blows my students away to think that in this war that none of them have heard of, we actually invaded Mexico and had captured Mexico City, right? So we are occupying the capital of a neighboring country. Now, at this point, a lot of people in the United States say, let's take all of Mexico, right? We captured Mexico City, why the hell not? Manifest destiny is in everybody's minds. We now think the United States is the way it is, that's the way it's always going to be. At the time of the U.S.-Mexico War, everything indicated to people that the U.S. would continue growing ridiculously. People were talking about manifest destiny extending the United States into South America, that eventually we would occupy all of Canada, all of South America would all be the United States. So a lot of people said, we've occupied Mexico City, let's take the whole country. What's going to stop us? The reason that this did not happen is that a lot of people in the United States felt strongly that they did not want Mexicans in large numbers in their country. So when you look at actually where the line ends up being drawn between the United States and Mexico, we are mostly annexing land that does not have large populations of Mexicans in it. And the densely populated southern portion of Mexico, the United States does not annex. This doesn't completely answer the question, though, because in point of fact, James K. Polk, the president, wanted to take about a third more of Mexico than he ultimately did. But because of Nicholas Trist, the hero of this story, Trist negotiated a treaty that gave less of Mexico to the United States than what Polk wanted.
I came late, so I didn't hear what you have to say before about the Mexican-American War. But this is my question. How objective this subject of history matter is taught in the highest school of the United States? That's it.
Well, that's a very good question. I brought my 13-year-old son with me from Pennsylvania for this talk. So I know that in his middle school it's taught objectively because I went in and I gave the lecture on it. So objectively, according to myself. You know, I don't believe it's taught very much at all. I think this was a really important war. 78,000 American men fought in this war. And we don't even know how many thousands of Mexicans died in this war. And the United States looks the way it does because of this war. And it's taught very, very little. Very little. And again, I think the main reason that the war is not taught is it's not the kind of war that Americans are proud of or that speaks to anything that we believe in as a people, right? We don't believe in invading neighboring republics and taking their land just because we can. That's not the kind of United States that we think that we live in, that we want to live in. And this is why some wars are remembered and some wars aren't. Because some wars are just, they're just ugly, and this was a very, very ugly war. It's not to say that it wasn't a great success for the United States. It was. But it was not a war about principle. And again, this is not, it's not a war that you're going to want to teach in the high schools. Teach about, necessarily.
But don't you think that was standard practice among strong countries at the time? I mean, just take the Belgians in the Congo.
Such a great
or
question.
The invasion of Spain by the French under Napoleon, you know.
Absolutely. So the question is,
you have seen the, you know, the drawings that Goya made of that invasion, you know. You see arms and legs hanging from trees and people decapitated and you know.
Strangely enough, my mother had one of those Goya drawings hanging in our garage near the washing machine that when I was a child I found extremely traumatizing. But Goya is fantastic. Nobody really has represented the horror of these kind of things as well as Goya has. So the question is, isn't this just the way strong countries treat weak countries? This is totally true. But the thing is, the United States didn't believe we were like other countries, right? People in the United States like to talk about how terrible Britain was. Britain took India, right, and it invaded China. That's not what kind of country we have, right? We have a republic. We don't have an empire. We treat other countries with respect because we respect ourselves. This is what Americans were claiming at the time while acting completely the opposite way. Now, there was a portion...
It's a whole different topic of discussion. I mean, we had half the population that enslaved an enormous, another, big piece of population, which is really the only reason for the Texas Revolution was not to secede from Mexico, but to be able to keep their slaves. You know?
Okay. So it's true. No, I don't want to get too much into the Texas thing, but I will say on the behalf of Texas, it wasn't 100% about slavery. It was probably 80% about slavery, but 20% of it was about taxes. That basically Mexico wanted to tax the Texans. So, there's...
But the topic is that it's not just in Mexico. There is a big portion of our history that was kept out of the textbooks because of the, we don't respect ourselves reading about this portion of the history,
Right. Well, somebody this morning told me about a bumper sticker that they saw that said, if you have a problem with immigration, talk to a Native American. So I thought that was great. In the back.
Are there any cemeteries in Mexico with U.S. soldiers?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So one of the really interesting things about this war is that very few of the soldiers who died in Mexico were brought back home, right? We think of this as common practice, right? If our soldiers get killed, we bring them back to the United States. That did not happen very much. So there are cemeteries with U.S. soldiers in them. And one thing I've thought about a lot is one of the reasons I think that Americans don't remember the U.S.-Mexico War is you will never go to a cemetery in the United States where anybody who was in the Mexico War died, right? Was buried. Okay, so Memorial Day gets started as a way to physically remember the Civil War dead, right? We're going to go to cemeteries and we're going to lay wreaths on the graves of Civil War dead and think about them. And the U.S.-Mexico War, the soldiers aren't, with the exception of Lexington, Kentucky brought back as many of their volunteers as they could and their soldiers and buried them in Lexington and put up a big monument. That's the only place you see that. Now, even worse, in the very southern part of Texas, where a lot of soldiers died of disease, they were kind of buried in these sand dunes, and then all the sand would blow away, and there'd basically be these dead bodies there. So this was another reason a lot of Americans had problems with it. The only people who really were brought back from the battlefield were people who were wealthy and important, like Henry Clay's son. He was brought back. John Hardin, he was brought back. But your average volunteer from Illinois, no.
There was no way to bring thousands of bodies back in a train that would take them 2 weeks to bring it back.
And also, the other thing to know about the Mexican War is even though the United States won every major engagement, Mexico was full of what were known as guerrilla partisans. And at a certain point, General Santa Anna, after he lost Veracruz, he basically sent out an order to wealthy landowners and said, we'll support you if you get a bunch of volunteer guerrillas together to fight the Americans because this was seen as the effective way to fight this war. So if you were trying to bring bodies back, most likely you'd just be killed. This is one of the problems with newspaper couriers, is they were so often killed trying to get news back to the major ports. It was a very, very hostile environment, which is really not a surprise. Yeah?
I know you were saying that the border was drawn basically by the victor, the United States,
Yeah.
as far as for the population, with anyone annexed to many Mexican. I've always been curious why Baja was not annexed, because it was not too populated at the time, and it's, as far as from California going down, it's part of geographically. I've always wondered, do you know anything about Baja?
Oh, I know all about Baja.
Why that was not the...
Also, growing up in Southern California, I also wondered about this. You know, the interesting thing about Baja is nobody in Mexico cared about it. People in Mexico City did not care about Baja. It was seen as having no value whatsoever. But Nicholas Trist, his initial instructions for the treaty that was to be drawn, specified to only take Baja if a certain amount of money was given by Mexico. So it was a very, very cheap offer for Baja. Baja was not seen as an area of crucial importance in the initial treaty. And Trist, who really turned against the war once he went to Mexico, and he said specifically he wanted to bring a close to the war with as little loss of land to Mexico as possible, did not push on Baja at all. He didn't ask for it. So to this day, when I give talks on this, people ask me, isn't it true that Nicholas Trist threw away Baja, that we could have had Baja? But the fact of the matter is Trist didn't push for any more land than he was told to push for by Polk in the initial treaty, and so he didn't push for Baja.
Hilton, Marriott, and I guess Hyatt were not as powerful back then as they are now.
Nobody knew about Cabo, did they? They had no idea how incredibly lucrative Cabo would be.
The Colorado River, the divides there, so it's geographically.
It's very strange.
But going back to the question of principles, how certain can we be that if Mexico had had the power to do the same thing in reverse, they wouldn't have done it? The Americans took the land from the Mexicans, but the Mexicans took it from the Spaniards, who in turn took it from the Indians, who in turn took it from the buffaloes, I suppose.
That's probably right, except for the buffalo part. It's true. And I'm sorry, I don't know if I made it clear. A lot of people in America thought exactly this way. And they said, you know what? This is all about being strong versus being weak. And, at the start of the war, a lot of people, especially religious people, they said, it is not moral to take land from a weaker nation. Now, everybody understood Mexico as being weaker. Like, there was no question in anyone's mind that Mexico was weak and pathetic. And initially, nobody thought the war was going to last more than a month. But they just thought that's not Christian. It's not the Christian thing to do. There were a lot of serious Christians. But a lot of other Americans said, you know what? We're strong. Let's take advantage of our situation. But again, this is not how we want to think about the United States being. You can also think of many examples in America's history where we could have gone and taken more land and didn't take it. We could have easily invaded Cuba in the 1850s and taken Cuba.
Well, it was on the table in order to strengthen the slave-holding states. Let's take Cuba or buy Cuba and have another state.
It's the most remarkable thing to me about expansion in this time period is that Cuba was not physically taken by the United States, because every president wanted Cuba. Everybody wanted Cuba, and didn't take it. So
there was a political party there that was in favor of annexation.
Absolutely, and there were some very
the majority, but
very wealthy people in New York City who had family ties and basically wanted it. We had one question. I'm sorry, over there. Yeah.
Louis Agassiz came to the United States in 1848 from Switzerland, and he had contacts, including time in a South Carolina hospital and time in Key West, that may also relate to and Anderson in Key West, connected to Cuba, Mexico, Louisiana. Are those circulations from the 1840s continuing, circulations that continue into the the Civil War.
You mean circulations between Europe and Key West and
Subterranean transshipment or elite
oh, absolutely, absolutely. And there are scholars who are working on that with relationship to the Civil War. Circulations of material and ideas between Europe and America in this time period.
Texas had a massive immigration at the time from Germany, actually.
Oh yeah,
So-
yeah, absolutely. And I was talking to actually a English as a second language teacher in Dallas, and she was saying the only English as a second language classes in Texas were either Spanish or they were German. So they're still actually German.
There's a whole, if you travel from San Antonio to Austin, along the hill country, it's all German names.
Yeah.
Bern and New Braunfels, and I mean, it's all German-looking houses. There's nothing left from a German culture there whatsoever, but it's all German-named cities and German.
Frederick Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, he toured through Texas in the 1850s, and he was so impressed by the Germans. Those were the only people that impressed him. But you go to a little German house in the middle of Texas in a village, and they would have a piano and they would have a library with scientific books. So Olmsted really felt like the Germans were the future of Texas because he was horrified by everything else that he found. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, folks. So once again, we have A Wicked War, as well as one of Professor Greenberg's previous titles, Manifest Destiny and American Territorial Expansion, for sale at the counter. She is going to be signing over there at the table to the left of the screen. And a reminder for our internet audience at home, if you call the number on your screen, you can get A Wicked War or Manifest Destiny and American Territorial Expansion signed for you, and we will ship it to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. And I hope that Goya drawing didn't cause you to avoid washing machines for the rest of your life. Hopefully you weren't that traumatized. All right. Well, please give Professor Greenberg a hand. Thank you very much.